The morning fog clung to the Tuscan hills like secrets whispered in ancient tongues, and Marcus Aurelius, not the emperor, but a modern man bearing an ancient name, stood at his office window watching the world pretend its civilization. Below him, the city moved with the practiced choreography of people who believed kindness and weakness were synonymous, who had forgotten that true gentleness required the strength to be dangerous when necessary. Marcus had learned this lesson the hard way, though it took him 43 years to understand what Niccolò Machiavelli had tried to teach the world 5 centuries ago. The transformation hadn't begun with philosophy or books, it had begun with humiliation so complete it felt like death. 3 years earlier, Marcus had been everything the modern world claimed to admire: accommodating, conflict-averse, always seeking consensus. He managed a mid-sized consulting firm with the touch of a diplomat, believing that if he was fair and kind enough, the universe would reciprocate. His employees respected him, his clients trusted him, and his wife Elena loved him for his gentle nature. He was, by all appearances, a successful man living in harmony with the values of a civilized society. The first crack in this facade appeared on a Tuesday morning when his largest client, Donovan Industries, called an emergency meeting. Marcus arrived at their corporate headquarters with presentations and proposals, ready to discuss their expansion project. Instead, he found himself facing Jonathan Donovan across a mahogany table that felt more like a tribunal than a conference room. "Marcus, we've appreciated your work over the years," Donovan began, his voice carrying the practiced sympathy of someone about to deliver a calculated blow. "But we've decided to move in a different direction. Effective immediately, we're terminating our contract." The words hit Marcus like cold water. Donovan Industries represented 60% of his firm's revenue. "Jonathan, if there's an issue with our service, we can address it." "We've worked together for 8 years, the issue isn't your service," Donovan interrupted, leaning forward with the smile of a predator who had already tasted blood. "It's your business model. We've been watching how you operate, always deferring to your team's opinions, never making hard decisions, treating business like a democracy rather than understanding that someone has to have the final word. We need partners who understand that being nice isn't the same as being effective." Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, a sensation like watching a foundation crack. "I believe in collaborative leadership, you believe in avoiding responsibility," Donovan cut him off again. "Last month, when we needed you to fire that underperforming project manager of yours, you spent 3 weeks trying to find a better solution instead of making the necessary decision. We lost time, money, and credibility because you couldn't stomach doing what needed to be done. That's not leadership, Marcus. That's cowardice dressed up as compassion." The meeting ended with handshakes that felt like eulogies and promises to transition the work smoothly, promises that everyone knew were lies wrapped in professional courtesy. As Marcus walked through the marble lobby of Donovan Industries, he caught his reflection in the polished walls and saw something that shook him: a man who looked defeated before he'd even begun to fight. That afternoon, Marcus sat in his office trying to calculate how many employees he would have to let go, how many dreams he would have to shatter because he had confused being pleasant with being strong. His assistant knocked and entered without waiting for permission, something she never would have done if she truly respected him, he realized now. "Mr. Aurelius, there's someone here to see you. He says it's about the Donovan situation." The man who entered Marcus's office was small in stature but carried himself with the kind of presence that made rooms feel smaller. He introduced himself as Vincent Toretti, though Marcus suspected this wasn't the name on his birth certificate. Vincent had olive skin marked by years that had been neither kind nor cruel but simply real, and eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw for future use. "I heard about your meeting with Donovan," Vincent said, settling into the chair across from Marcus's desk without invitation. "Word travels fast in certain circles." "Who are you?" Marcus asked, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to know. "Someone who's made a career out of understanding what you're learning today," Vincent replied. "That the world isn't a democracy, and niceness without strength is just another form of weakness that predators can smell from miles away." Marcus studied the man across from him. There was something unsettling about Vincent's calm, the way he seemed completely comfortable in his own skin despite, or perhaps because of, the obvious fact that he was dangerous in ways Marcus couldn't quite articulate. "I don't understand what you want from me," Marcus said. "I don't want anything from you," Vincent corrected. "I want to offer you something." A different way of seeing the world. You've spent your entire career believing that if you were good enough, fair enough, accommodating enough, everyone would play by the same rules. Today you learned that's not how the game works. Vincent reached into his jacket and withdrew a worn leather book. The cover bore the title The Prince in faded gold lettering. A friend of mine, a man who understood power better than most, once told me that there are two types of people in this world, those who shape reality and those who are shaped by it. For 43 years, you've been shaped. The question is whether you're ready to start shaping. Marcus took the book, feeling its weight in his hands. And if I am? Then, you learn what Machiavelli really meant when he wrote about the lion and the fox. Most people think he was advocating cruelty for its own sake, but that's the interpretation of people who never understood that sometimes kindness requires the capacity for violence, and sometimes peace demands the readiness for war. Over the following weeks, as Marcus navigated the collapse of his business model and the inevitable layoffs that followed, he found himself returning to Vincent's words and Machiavelli's text. The Prince wasn't the manual for tyranny that modern sensibilities had made it out to be. It was a guide for surviving in a world where good intentions without power were worthless, where virtue without the ability to defend it was mere naivety. Marcus began to understand that his failure hadn't been in being too kind, it had been in being kind without wisdom, generous without boundaries, trusting without verification. He had mistaken passivity for peace, avoidance for tolerance, and weakness for virtue. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It began with small changes, speaking with authority rather than seeking permission, making decisions quickly and accepting responsibility for the consequences, understanding that respect had to be earned through competence and strength rather than gifted through niceness. When Elena asked him about the changes she was seeing in him, Marcus struggled to explain. "I'm not becoming cruel," he told her one evening as they walked through their neighborhood, past houses full of people who still believed the world was essentially fair. "I'm learning to be dangerous in service of the things I love." "What does that mean?" Elena asked, though something in her voice suggested she was beginning to understand. "It means I'm learning that protecting our life, our values, our future, all of that requires the willingness to fight for it. Not because I want conflict, but because conflict will find me whether I want it or not. The only choice is whether I'll be prepared." 3 months after the Donovan meeting, Marcus received a call from Vincent. They met at a small cafe in the old part of the city, where Vincent ordered espresso and Marcus realized he was no longer the same man who had sat in that conference room being dissected by a predator. "You look different," Vincent observed. "More awake." Marcus nodded. "I've been thinking about something you said about people who shape reality versus people who are shaped by it. I realized I'd been living as if the world owed me fairness, as if being good was enough to guarantee good outcomes. And now I understand that the world doesn't owe me anything. If I want fairness, I have to create it. If I want my values to survive, I have to be strong enough to defend them. If I want to be truly gentle, I have to be capable of violence that I choose not to use." Vincent smiled, and, for the first time, Marcus saw warmth in those calculating eyes. "Machiavelli would have liked you. He understood that the choice isn't between good and evil, it's between effectiveness and irrelevance. A weak good man accomplishes nothing. A strong good man can change the world." That evening, Marcus returned home to find Elena reading in their living room. She looked up as he entered, and he saw something new in her expression, a recognition that the man she had married was still there, but had become more than he was before. "How was your day?" she asked, though the question carried weight beyond its simple words. "Productive," Marcus replied, and they both understood that everything was different now, and somehow more right than it had been when he believed that being harmless was the same as being good. Outside their windows, the city continued its dance of civilized pretense, but Marcus no longer felt the need to apologize for understanding that beneath every functional society lay the capacity for controlled violence, the readiness to defend what mattered, the wisdom to be dangerous in service of what was gentle and good. The weak version of himself, the man who had confused niceness with strength, avoidance with wisdom, passivity with virtue, was dying. And Marcus was finally learning what it meant to be truly alive in a world that mistook sheep for saints and predators for leaders. In his study that night, Marcus opened Machiavelli's book to a passage he had marked, "Since love and fear can hardly exist together, if we must choose between them, it is far safer to be feared than loved. But Marcus was beginning to understand that Machiavelli had been writing for princes trying to hold kingdoms together, not for men trying to build lives worth living. The real lesson wasn't about choosing fear over love, it was about being worthy of love by being strong enough to protect what you loved. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, because he has already done the hardest work. He has killed the version of himself that the world could devour, and built something stronger in its place. Marcus was learning to be dangerous not because he enjoyed it, but because the gentle world he wanted to live in could only exist when good people were willing to be terrible to those who threatened it. As the night deepened over the Tuscan hills, Marcus Aurelius, named for an emperor but becoming something perhaps more important, a man who understood that true strength served true goodness, continued his education in the art of being dangerous in service of gentleness, of being feared by those who deserved fear so that he could be loved by those who deserved love. The transformation was far from complete, but the foundation was solid. He would never again be the kind of good man who accomplished nothing because he was too weak to accomplish anything. He would be the kind of man who could build and defend a gentle world precisely because he was dangerous enough to destroy anyone who threatened it. This was the beginning of his real education, not in cruelty, but in the terrible responsibility of strength. Not in abandoning virtue, but in making virtue powerful enough to survive in a world where weakness was the only true sin, and goodness without strength was just another form of selfishness, leaving the real work of protecting civilization to others while claiming moral superiority for one's own uselessness. Marcus closed the book and looked out at the city lights, each one representing someone trying to navigate the same eternal human challenge: how to be good in a world that didn't always reward goodness, how to be strong without becoming what you fought against, how to be dangerous in service of everything gentle and beautiful and worth protecting. Tomorrow would bring new tests, new opportunities to practice this delicate balance between the lion and the fox, between strength and wisdom, between the capacity for violence and the choice to use it only in service of something larger than oneself. But tonight, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the quiet confidence of a man who was no longer afraid of his own power, because he had learned to wield it in service of something worthy of that power. The weak self was dying. The dangerous self was being born. And, somewhere between destruction and creation, Marcus was discovering what it truly meant to be a man who could be trusted with strength, because he understood that strength without virtue was mere brutality, but virtue without strength was mere sentiment, beautiful, perhaps, but ultimately useless in a world where good people needed protection and evil people needed stopping. The art of being dangerous in a gentle world wasn't about becoming cruel. It was about becoming capable of protecting what mattered, defending what was good, and ensuring that gentleness could exist because someone was strong enough to make space for it in a world that had never promised to be kind. 6 months had passed since Marcus's awakening, and the world had become a different place, not because it had changed, but because he had learned to see it clearly. His consulting firm had not merely survived the loss of Donovan Industries, it had evolved into something more focused, more intentional. He had discovered that when you stopped trying to please everyone, you could finally serve those who deserved your service. The morning brought news that would test everything Vincent and Machiavelli had taught him. Sarah Chen, his former project manager, the one Donovan had wanted fired, walked into his office with tears in her eyes and a determination that reminded Marcus of his younger self. "They're trying to destroy me," Sarah said without preamble. She had landed a position at Morrison & Associates after Marcus had been forced to let her go, but success had painted a target on her back. "Richard Morrison is spreading rumors that I stole proprietary information from you when I left. He's trying to get me blacklisted from every major firm in the city." Marcus studied Sarah's face, seeing in her desperation the same helplessness he had felt in Donovan's conference room. But, where his younger self would have offered sympathy and gentle suggestions, his transformed understanding demanded something more surgical. "What kind of evidence does he have?" Marcus asked. "None, because it's not true." "But that doesn't seem to matter. He's connected, respected, and I'm just someone trying to build a career." He knows that perception becomes reality if you have enough influence to shape it. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his mind working through possibilities the way Vincent had taught him, not looking for the nicest solution, but for the most effective one. "Tell me about Morrison. What does he want that he doesn't have?" Sarah wiped her eyes, confused by the direction of the conversation. "I don't understand."
Every predator has vulnerabilities. Morrison is attacking you because he perceives you as weak and isolated. The question is, what is he protecting? What would he be afraid to lose? Over the next hour, Marcus extracted information from Sarah with the patience of a surgeon and the precision of an interrogator. Morrison and Associates was bidding on a massive municipal contract, the kind of project that could define a firm for a decade. Morrison's reputation was built on being above reproach, a pillar of professional integrity. He was also, according to Sarah's observations during her brief tenure there, cutting corners on several existing projects while charging premium rates. "Here's what we're going to do," Marcus said finally. "You're going to document everything you observed at Morrison's firm, every shortcut, every billing irregularity, every corner they cut. We're going to build a case so thorough that when Morrison tries to attack your reputation, we can destroy his." Sarah looked uncomfortable. "That feels wrong. Vindictive." Marcus recognized the sentiment. It was his old self speaking through her, the voice of someone who still believed that taking the high road meant accepting defeat with grace. "Sarah, let me ask you something. If Morrison succeeds in destroying your career based on lies, what happens to the next person he targets? What happens to the clients who trust him with their projects while he cuts corners? What happens to the employees who believe in doing good work when they see that lying and manipulation are rewarded while honesty and competence are punished?" She was quiet for a long moment. "But if we attack him, we're not attacking him," Marcus corrected. "We're defending you. And, in defending you, we're defending the principle that truth should matter more than influence, that competence should triumph over connection. Morrison made this a war when he chose lies over competition. We're just ensuring he loses it." That afternoon, Marcus called Vincent. They met at the same cafe where Marcus had begun to understand the difference between being harmless and being good. "You're learning," Vincent observed after Marcus had explained the situation. "But, you're still thinking like someone who believes in fair play. Morrison doesn't. He's counting on your conscience to handicap you while he uses every advantage he has." "What would you do?" Marcus asked. Vincent smiled. "I would remember that Machiavelli wrote about the lion and the fox for a reason. The lion represents force, direct, obvious, overwhelming. The fox represents cunning, indirect, subtle, unexpected. Morrison expects you to play the lion, to confront him directly, to file complaints and make accusations. He's prepared for that because he has more institutional power than you do. So we play the fox. We play the fox. We don't attack Morrison, we create conditions where he destroys himself. We don't make accusations, we ask questions that force him to reveal his own guilt. We don't fight him on ground he's chosen, we change the terrain entirely." Vincent leaned forward, and Marcus saw in his eyes the gleam of someone who enjoyed the intellectual challenge of strategic thinking. Morrison's strength is his reputation and his connections. But reputations are fragile things, especially when they're built on lies. Here's what you do: you investigate his firm not to find dirt, but to find truth. When you find that truth, you don't reveal it, you use it to ask innocent questions at exactly the right moments, in exactly the right forums. Over the following weeks, Marcus and Sarah worked with the methodical patience of archaeologists, uncovering layer after layer of Morrison's professional deceptions. They discovered that his firm had been billing clients for senior partners' time while having junior associates do the work. They found evidence of corner cutting on safety inspections, of presentations that used outdated data while claiming it was current research, of promises made to clients that the firm had no intention of keeping. But, instead of gathering this information to attack Morrison directly, Marcus deployed it strategically. At industry networking events, he asked seemingly innocent questions. "Has anyone else noticed irregularities in municipal safety reports lately?" At professional conferences, he mentioned concerns about billing transparency that just happened to match Morrison's practices. The brilliance of the approach became clear when Morrison, feeling pressure from the questions Marcus was raising, made a critical error. At a public forum on professional standards, Morrison stood up to defend practices that no one had yet accused him of using.
These wild accusations about billing irregularities and corner-cutting are exactly the kind of unfounded rumors that damage our entire industry, Morrison declared, his voice carrying the righteous indignation of someone who believed his reputation made him untouchable. The room fell silent.
No one had made any accusations.
Morrison had essentially confessed to crimes no one had charged him with, in front of an audience of his peers and potential clients. Marcus watched from the back of the room as Morrison's face went through the stages of realization. The man had destroyed himself with his own paranoia, revealing not only that he was guilty of the practices Marcus had been questioning, but that he knew he was guilty. 3 days later, Morrison and Associates was removed from consideration for the municipal contract. A week after that, Richard Morrison called Sarah to apologize for the misunderstanding and to offer her a senior position at his firm, an offer she declined with the kind of dignified professionalism that only someone who had won a war could afford. That evening, Marcus sat in his study reading Machiavelli's observations on the nature of power and the responsibilities it carried.
Elena found him there, noting the quiet satisfaction in his expression.
"You look like a man who's learned something important," she said. Marcus closed the book and looked at his wife, seeing in her face the kind of respect that he had tried to earn through kindness for years but had only achieved through strength. "I learned that being dangerous doesn't mean being cruel," he said. "It means being capable of protecting what matters, defending what's right, and ensuring that truth has the power to prevail over lies."
Morrison tried to destroy Sarah's career based on lies because he believed she was powerless.
When he discovered she wasn't powerless, that she had allies who understood how to fight, he destroyed himself rather than continue a war he couldn't win.
Elena sat down across from him. "And how do you feel about becoming the kind of man who can wage that kind of war?"
Marcus considered the question carefully. 6 months ago, he would have felt guilty for using strategic thinking to defeat an enemy. He would have worried that he was becoming something he didn't want to be.
"I feel responsible," he said finally.
"Responsible for protecting people who do good work, for defending principles that matter, for ensuring that competence and integrity aren't disadvantages in a world where lying and manipulation are common strategies."
Morrison chose to be a predator.
"I chose to be what predators fear most, someone who understands their methods but uses them in service of something larger than personal gain." The transformation Marcus had begun months earlier was accelerating, but in directions he hadn't expected. He was learning that true strength wasn't about dominating others, it was about creating conditions where good people could thrive and bad people couldn't. It wasn't about being feared by everyone, it was about being feared by those who deserved fear while remaining someone worth trusting for those who deserved trust. Vincent had been right about one thing: the world didn't operate on fairness, but that didn't mean fairness was impossible. It simply meant that fairness had to be created and defended by people strong enough to make it real. Over the following months, word spread through the professional community that Marcus Aurelius had become someone to be taken seriously. Not because he was cruel or ruthless, but because he was competent and unafraid to ask difficult questions, unafraid to challenge established power when it was being misused, unafraid to defend people who deserved defending even when it was inconvenient. His consulting firm began attracting a different kind of client, people who wanted results rather than flattery, solutions rather than sympathy. They came to him precisely because they knew he was dangerous enough to be effective but principled enough to use that effectiveness in service of their genuine interests rather than his own ego. Marcus discovered that once you stopped being afraid of conflict became much less frequent. People who were accustomed to winning through intimidation and manipulation found themselves facing someone who understood their methods but couldn't be intimidated or manipulated. Most chose to find easier targets rather than engage in wars they weren't sure they could win. But the most important change was internal. Marcus no longer felt the constant anxiety of someone trying to navigate a hostile world with inadequate tools. He had become what Machiavelli had written about: a man who understood that virtue without power was impotent, but power without virtue was corrupting. The key was developing both simultaneously, becoming strong enough to defend what was right while remaining committed to defending only what was actually right. Sarah had returned to working with Marcus's firm as an independent contractor, bringing with her other talented people who had been marginalized by firms that valued politics over performance. They formed the core of something new, a professional community that operated on the principle that competence combined with integrity was more powerful than connection combined with deception. The beautiful thing about being dangerous in service of good, Marcus told Elena one evening as they watched the sunset from their terrace, is that you attract other people who understand the difference. You build a community of people who are strong enough to do the right thing even when it's difficult.
Elena smiled. And what about people like Morrison? What happens when they realize they can't intimidate you anymore? Marcus considered the question.
They either change their methods or they find easier targets.
Most bullies are fundamentally cowards, they only attack when they're confident they can win.
When they realize they can't win easily, they usually choose not to fight at all. The evening air carried the scent of jasmine and the distant sound of the city going about its business, thousands of people navigating their own versions of the eternal human challenge between strength and kindness, between effectiveness and virtue. Marcus had learned that these weren't opposing forces but complementary ones.
True kindness required the strength to defend it. Real virtue demanded the power to make it effective.
The gentle world he wanted to live in could only exist when good people were dangerous enough to protect it from those who would destroy it. As the stars emerged over the Tuscan landscape, Marcus reflected on how much had changed since that humiliating morning in Donovan's conference room. He had thought then that his problem was being too trusting, too accommodating, too kind. Now he understood that his problem had been being these things without wisdom, without boundaries, without the strategic intelligence to distinguish between those who deserved his kindness and those who would exploit it. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, not because he becomes invulnerable, but because he becomes someone who understands that vulnerability and strength aren't opposites. They're different aspects of the same thing, the courage to be fully human in a world that often rewarded those who chose to be less. Marcus Aurelius was no longer the man who could be destroyed by a Jonathan Donovan or a Richard Morrison, not because he had become harder, but because he had become more complete. He had integrated the lion and the fox, the capacity for force and the wisdom to use it sparingly, the ability to be dangerous and the judgment to be dangerous only in service of what was worth protecting. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to practice this delicate balance between strength and virtue. But, tonight, Marcus felt the deep satisfaction of a man who had learned to navigate the world as it actually was while working to make it more like what it should be. He had become dangerous enough to be truly gentle, strong enough to be genuinely kind, and wise enough to know the difference between enemies who needed defeating and people who simply needed understanding. The art of being dangerous in a gentle world wasn't about choosing sides between power and principle. It was about understanding that real principle required real power to make it more than just beautiful sentiment, and real power required real principle to make it more than mere domination. Marcus had found his balance, and, in finding it, he had discovered something that would have surprised his younger self. Being dangerous in service of goodness wasn't a corruption of his values, it was the fulfillment of them. 2 years had transformed Marcus from someone who feared his own capacity for strength into someone who wielded it with surgical precision. But the true test of his evolution came not from external enemies but from the internal challenge that faced every person who learned to be dangerous, the seductive corruption of power itself. It began with a phone call on a Wednesday morning that felt like any other. The voice belonged to Catherine Morrison, Richard Morrison's younger sister, and it carried the weight of someone who had discovered that her entire understanding of her family had been built on lies. "Mr. Aurelius, I need to speak with you about my brother," Catherine said, her words careful but determined. "I've learned things about how his business operates, about what he did to your colleague Sarah Chen, about practices I can't continue to ignore." Marcus listened as Catherine explained her position as a junior partner in Morrison & Associates, her growing awareness of the firm's systematic deceptions, and her desire to do something about it. But, as she spoke, Marcus found himself calculating not just how to help her, but how to use her revelations to completely destroy what remained of Richard Morrison's professional life. The thoughts came naturally now, the strategic analysis of vulnerabilities and the methodical planning of decisive action. Catherine Morrison wasn't just someone seeking justice, she was an opportunity to eliminate a threat permanently, to send a message to others who might consider using Morrison's methods.
"What exactly are you proposing?" Marcus asked, though part of his mind was already constructing a campaign that would leave Morrison & Associates in ruins.
I want to expose the truth about what my brother has been doing. I have access to files, communications, billing records, everything. But, I need help knowing how to use it responsibly. The word responsibly stopped Marcus's strategic planning like a brake. He recognized the moment for what it was, a crossroads between justice and vengeance, between being dangerous in service of principle and being dangerous for its own sake. That afternoon, Marcus met with Vincent at their usual cafe, but this time he came with questions instead of plans.
When does being dangerous in service of good become being dangerous for the pleasure of winning? Marcus asked without preamble.
Vincent studied his protégé with the attention of someone who had been waiting for exactly this question. The moment you start enjoying the destruction more than you care about what you're building.
The moment your enemy's suffering becomes more important to you than your ally's protection.
Marcus described Catherine's offer and his own initial response to it, the immediate calculation of how to maximize damage rather than how to achieve justice.
Machiavelli wrote about this too, Vincent said, pulling out his own worn copy of The Prince.
He understood that the capacity for strategic thinking could become addictive, that the intellectual satisfaction of outmaneuvering enemies could become an end in itself rather than a means to something worthwhile.
Vincent found the passage he was looking for.
A prince must learn not only when to use the beast within himself, but when to restrain it.
The lion and the fox are tools, not masters. The moment they become masters, the prince becomes a tyrant, and tyrants always destroy themselves. Marcus felt the weight of recognition.
His transformation from weakness to strength had been necessary, but it carried its own dangers. The skills that had protected him and others could just as easily be used to indulge his ego, to settle scores, to demonstrate power for power's sake.
So what do I do with Catherine Morrison? Marcus asked. You ask yourself a different question.
Not how can I destroy Richard Morrison, but how can I protect the people he's harmed and prevent him from harming others? The answer to those questions might involve his destruction, but that destruction becomes a means rather than an end. That evening, Marcus sat in his study with Machiavelli's book open, but his mind was working through the deeper implications of what Vincent had taught him. The art of being dangerous in a gentle world wasn't just about learning to use power, it was about learning not to be used by power. When Elena found him there, she immediately noticed the tension in his posture.
What's troubling you? She asked.
Marcus explained the situation with Catherine Morrison and his own conflicted response to it. I've learned to be effective, to protect what matters, to fight when fighting is necessary. But I'm discovering that there's a difference between being someone who can be dangerous and being someone who wants to be dangerous.
Elena sat down beside him. And which one are you becoming?
The question hung between them like a challenge. Marcus realized that his wife was asking not just about this specific situation, but about the direction of his entire transformation. I'm becoming someone who enjoys being good at strategic thinking, Marcus said slowly. Someone who takes satisfaction in being able to outmaneuver people who try to use manipulation and intimidation.
The question is whether that satisfaction is serving something larger than itself or whether it's becoming the point.
Over the next several days, Marcus wrestled with the distinction between justice and vengeance, between being dangerous in service of principle and being dangerous for the intellectual satisfaction it provided. He realized that Machiavelli's greatest insight wasn't about the techniques of power, it was about the psychology of those who wielded it. The Prince wasn't a manual for tyrants, it was a warning about how quickly good men could become the very things they fought against if they lost sight of why they were fighting. When Marcus finally met with Catherine Morrison, he came with a different approach than he had originally planned.
Catherine, before we discuss what to do about your brother's practices, I need to understand something. What do you want to achieve? Do you want to see him punished, or do you want to see the problems he's created solved? Catherine looked surprised by the question. I want him to stop harming people. I want his victims to be protected, and I want the clients he's defrauding to know the truth.
Those are different goals, Marcus explained.
Punishing your brother might not protect his victims. Protecting his victims might not require punishing your brother.
If we're going to work together, we need to be clear about what we're actually trying to accomplish. Over the following weeks, Marcus and Catherine developed a strategy that was surgical rather than destructive. Instead of exposing Morrison and Associates in a way that would destroy the firm and leave its employees unemployed, they created conditions that forced Richard Morrison to choose between changing his practices or losing his position. They documented the firm's billing irregularities and corner cutting, but instead of releasing the information publicly, they presented it to the firm's other partners with a clear message. These practices represented legal and reputational risks that needed to be addressed immediately. The beauty of the approach was that it gave Morrison's partners the information they needed to protect themselves and their clients while leaving Richard Morrison with a choice. He could acknowledge his mistakes, make restitution to the clients he had defrauded, and operate his business ethically going forward. Or he could refuse to change and face the consequences of his partner's decision to protect themselves. Marcus watched the situation unfold with the satisfaction of someone who had learned to use his capabilities in service of actual justice rather than personal vindication. Morrison chose to fight rather than reform, and his partners chose to remove him from the firm rather than risk their own reputations and legal standing. But the victory felt different from what Marcus had expected when he first learned to be dangerous. There was satisfaction in the effectiveness of the strategy, but it was tempered by the recognition that Morrison's downfall was the consequence of his own choices rather than Marcus's cleverness.
How do you feel about how it ended? Elena asked him on the evening when news of Morrison's departure from his own firm became public.
Marcus considered the question carefully. I feel like I did what needed to be done without becoming something I didn't want to be.
Morrison's practices were harming people, and now they're not.
His victims have been protected, and his ability to create new victims has been curtailed. But I didn't destroy him for the pleasure of destroying him. I created conditions where his own choices determined his fate.
Elena smiled.
You sound like someone who's learned the difference between being powerful and being corrupted by power. The observation was more profound than Marcus had initially realized. Over the following months, as word spread about his role in the Morrison situation, he began receiving requests for help from people facing similar challenges with predatory employers, manipulative clients, and abusive systems. Each situation required him to make the same fundamental choice, whether to use his capabilities to achieve justice or to satisfy his ego. The temptation was always there, the seductive appeal of demonstrating superiority, of winning for the sake of winning, of using his skills to dominate rather than to protect. But Marcus had learned to recognize that temptation and to resist it. He developed what he came to think of as the Machiavellian discipline, the ability to be dangerous when danger was required while remaining committed to being dangerous only in service of something worth protecting. Vincent noticed the change during one of their regular meetings. "You're not the same person who came to me 2 years ago," he observed. "But you're also not the person I expected you to become."
"What did you expect?" Marcus asked.
"I expected you to become effective but cynical, strategic but cold. Instead, you've become something more interesting, someone who understands power but isn't seduced by it, someone who can be dangerous but chooses not to be except when necessary." Vincent leaned forward with the intensity of someone sharing a hard-won insight. Most people who learn to be dangerous make one of two mistakes. They either use their new capabilities too little, reverting to their old patterns of weakness when facing serious threats. Or they use them too much, becoming the kind of person who sees every problem as a nail because they've finally learned to be a hammer.
"And the alternative?" Marcus asked.
"The alternative is what you're becoming, someone who has integrated strength and wisdom, who understands that being capable of violence and choosing not to use it is more powerful than being incapable of violence and calling that choice virtue." As Marcus reflected on Vincent's words, he realized that his transformation had reached a new stage. The weak man who had been destroyed by Jonathan Donovan was gone, but he hadn't been replaced by someone who sought to destroy others. Instead, he had become someone who understood that true strength lay in the careful, principled use of power in service of goals larger than personal satisfaction. The art of being dangerous in a gentle world, Marcus now understood, wasn't about learning to use force, it was about learning when not to use it. It wasn't about becoming someone who could destroy enemies, it was about becoming someone who could create conditions where enemies either reformed themselves or eliminated themselves through their own choices. 6 months later, Marcus received a letter from Richard Morrison. It was brief and formal, acknowledging the harm his practices had caused and expressing gratitude for the way Marcus had handled the situation. Morrison had started a new consulting practice focused on helping small businesses avoid the ethical pitfalls he had fallen into himself. "He's probably not a reformed man," Marcus told Elena as they discussed the letter. "But he's learned that there are consequences for predatory behavior, and he's chosen to find a different way to make a living. Sometimes that's the best outcome you can achieve, not conversion, but containment."
Elena looked thoughtful. "Do you think he would have changed if you had simply exposed him publicly instead of giving him the choice to reform?"
Marcus shook his head.
"Public destruction would have made him a victim in his own mind.
By giving him the choice, we made him responsible for the consequences. People can only learn from outcomes they understand they created themselves." As spring returned to the Tuscan hills, Marcus found himself thinking about the journey from weakness to strength to wisdom. He had learned that being dangerous in a gentle world required more than just the capacity for strategic thinking or the willingness to fight when fighting was necessary. It required the discipline to remain committed to principles even when you had the power to ignore them, the wisdom to distinguish between enemies who needed defeating and people who needed teaching, and the humility to remember that power was a tool rather than an identity. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, not because he becomes invulnerable, but because he becomes someone who understands that real invulnerability comes from being strong enough to be vulnerable, dangerous enough to be gentle, and wise enough to know when each is appropriate. Marcus had learned to be dangerous not because he enjoyed it, but because the world required good people to be capable of protecting what they valued. He had learned to be strategic not because he was naturally cunning, but because effectiveness in service of virtue was a moral obligation for anyone who wanted to make the world more just. Most importantly, he had learned that the choice between being strong and being good was a false choice. Real strength served real goodness, and real goodness required real strength to survive in a world where weakness was often exploited and kindness was frequently mistaken for powerlessness. On a warm evening in late spring, Marcus stood on his terrace looking out over the city lights, each one representing someone facing their own version of the eternal human challenge: how to be strong without becoming cruel, how to be gentle without becoming weak, how to be dangerous in service of everything gentle and beautiful and worth protecting. Vincent's lessons, Machiavelli's insights, and his own hard-won experience had taught him that this balance wasn't achieved once and maintained effortlessly. It was a daily choice, a constant calibration between competing values, an ongoing commitment to being worthy of the power one possessed. Elena joined him on the terrace, and they stood together in comfortable silence, two people who had learned that true partnership required both people to be complete individuals, strong enough to stand alone but wise enough to choose to stand together.
"What are you thinking about?" Elena asked.
Marcus smiled, feeling the deep satisfaction of someone who had found his way through a difficult transformation and emerged more himself than he had ever been before. "I'm thinking about how grateful I am for that humiliating meeting with Jonathan Donovan," he said. "If he hadn't shown me how weak I was, I never would have learned how to be strong. If I hadn't learned how to be strong, I never would have learned how to be truly gentle. And if I hadn't learned both, I never would have learned that the art of being dangerous in a gentle world isn't about choosing between power and principle, it's about understanding that real principle requires real power, and real power requires real principle." The night air carried the scent of jasmine and the distant sound of the city going about its eternal business. Somewhere out there, people were learning to be strong for the first time, people were struggling with the corruption that power could bring, people were discovering that the choice between being good and being effective was a false choice that weak people made to justify their weakness and cruel people made to justify their cruelty. Marcus had learned that there was a third way, the way of principled strength, of dangerous gentleness, of power wielded in service of something larger than itself. It wasn't the easiest path, but it was the only path that led to the kind of life worth living and the kind of world worth building. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, because he has learned the most important lesson of all, that real strength isn't about dominating others, it's about mastering yourself. And that mastery, the ability to be dangerous when danger is required, gentle when gentleness is appropriate, and wise enough to know the difference, was the foundation of everything good and strong and beautiful that human beings could create together. As the stars emerged over the Tuscan landscape, Marcus felt the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to navigate the world as it actually was while working to make it more like what it should be. He had become dangerous enough to be truly gentle, strong enough to be genuinely kind, and wise enough to know that the art of being dangerous in a gentle world was really the art of being fully human in service of everything that made humanity worth preserving and protecting. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to practice this delicate balance between strength and virtue, new chances to demonstrate that being dangerous and being good weren't opposing forces but complementary aspects of a complete human life. But, tonight, Marcus rested in the knowledge that he had found his way through the labyrinth of power and principle, and had emerged as someone who could be trusted with strength because he understood that strength without virtue was mere brutality, but virtue without strength was mere sentiment, beautiful perhaps, but ultimately useless in a world where good people needed protection and evil needed stopping. The art of being dangerous in a gentle world was the art of being worthy of the power you possessed, and Marcus had learned to be very dangerous indeed, dangerous to those who threatened what he loved, gentle to those who deserved his care, and wise enough to know that the greatest danger of all was losing sight of the difference.